First off, I want to first thank you all for coming tonight. A lot of stuff to cover. I'm going to try my best to not go just lickety-split with this. This is to say that it's a huge topic is the greatest understatement I could make. This is like trying to do a doctoral dissertation in an hour and a quarter. Why do this talk? That's the one thing. My friend Steve came up and said, is this going to be, I get this question often, you're going to talk about this, you're going to use slides. Is this going to be like watching Mel Gibson's movie again? Is it? No, it's mostly artwork, but very little scientific and medical. Yes, that's how I got interested in this topic. And that's going to be a part of what we talk about today. But as I've gotten more involved in this particular interest, the theological part, the spiritual part of it, we'll talk about that. The historical part, whether you are a Christian or not, I would defy anybody to say that there is any event more important in the history of mankind than what we're talking about tonight. The forensic and legal part of it is not a big part of this talk, but it is a part that is very important, and you'll know it when we get to it. I don't like this term symbolic. I'm going to have to put a slash in there and change it to symbolic and relevant or relevance. To look at the Passion and the Crucifixion without an awareness of the Old Testament, you lose the story. The meaningfulness of the story is just integrated into what's in the Old Testament. And the personal part of it. Here's the personal part of it. So, March of 1986. Is that too loud for you? Is it doing okay? Okay. March of 1986. I'm a fourth-year medical student. I have not yet, within a few days after this, an article appeared. I would find out where I was going to do my residency. Living in Alabama, going to do my residency in Springfield, Illinois. Didn't know where this was going to go. I'm married. I got 2 kids. We got a couple dimes to rub together. We're eating grilled cheese and popcorn in an unair-conditioned house in Mobile, Alabama, and living the dream. So anxiety, angst, and misery were not that. We're kind of the mode. Journal of the American Medical Association, March 1986. This article appears. And I distinctly remember the day, that was pre-internet, pre-online, everything else. So the JAMA comes out, J-A-M-A, and I'm flipping through the pages, and one of the lead articles, Special Communication, is this. Now, I will tell you that this is the last time anything that was neutral or pro-Christian showed up in the AMA Journal. Here we are, 40 years later, they've become as secular as the culture has. This is an article written by 3 co-authors, an interesting mix. A pathologist from Mayo Clinic, a medical illustrator from Mayo Clinic, and a Methodist minister from Rochester. And they put this article together. I was really taken with this because I was going to go into orthopedics, and orthopedics is a very trauma-oriented specialty. You need to know about trauma. You need to know about physical injury. And it was extremely well illustrated. You'll see some black and white illustrations as we go through this. So this is what initially got my attention. And if you look back at the history of this subject, it goes back to the 1600s. As far as any kind of a scientific inquiry, it goes back to the 16th century. When Lipsius did his paper, I believe he was Belgian or Dutch, on the Cruce, the cross. And he was one of the first not only to talk about it from the medical aspect, but one of the first illustrated descriptions of it. The first relatively modern treatise of it, 1847, Stroud, a physician in London, a treatise on the physical cause of the death of Christ. So this was really kind of the beginning of modern investigations of it. If there's a more recent book to recommend to anybody, this is from 1953, Pierre Barbet. Barbet is a French surgeon who did one of the best scientific treatises of this as well. So there are a lot of things you can find online now if you look at the websites related to the Shroud Tour and things like that. So, all right. So when you see this image here, you'll see this 2 or 3 times more during the talk. I will relate a little bit to the Shroud of Turin about this, but this is what, you know how you can do a 3D reconstruction. This is a 3D reconstruction of what the face looks like on the Shroud. But to talk about the life of Jesus, the dates are relatively uncertain. As far as his date of birth, this always intrigues me. He was born BC. Wait. This is not hard math. Born, what does BC stand for? It's not before Christmas. It's not before, the catalog. So anyway, it's when the Julian calendar was set up. 0 BC. Okay, it's kind of eyeball it. We'll put it there. But when you go back through the historical record, particularly the ancient Greeks, which we'll refer to a lot tonight, it was somewhere in this period. He was born and died somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. Traditionally, it's the most common description is he died at 33 years of age. Okay, that was at the time of crucifixion. So we take that information. At the time this all happened, we would work in this time frame between 30 and 33 AD by our current calendar. These would have happened sometime in early April, single digits, 3rd to the 7th of early April in those years during the Passover festival. On the Jewish calendar, Nisan is the month that this would occur. And the months, it would typically bridge between late March and early April. Nisan is the first month of their ecclesiastical, their liturgical year. And on the Jewish calendar, appropriately, it's known as Chodesh HaYashua, meaning the month of salvation. So if there's a certain amount of time and you're going to find the time of year for this to happen, it's going to be Chodesh HaYashua. And then Jesus' physical condition. Don't focus on what he's like now. I mean, obviously at this point in time during this event. This is a man who, what happened with particularly the firstborn male, or the only born male. As he grows up, he's going to be working with his dad. This is not a confrontative. This is not a guy that, that's sitting around playing poker with the boys. This is a guy who's on his feet. You don't go anywhere except by walking. That's how you get there. So this is not a guy who is he's gonna take a hit. He's physically fit, as best we can tell, just by the circumstances of his life. And again, if you work on the assumption, which is a totally different subject, is a Shroud of Turin truly the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? If it is, then you take the measurements on the shroud, you end up with a guy that's about 5 feet 10 and 175 pounds. And part of that information is important because if you look at, there's some medical terms I'll throw out, and if they're not clear to everybody, let me know. Total blood volume. Total blood volume is all of the blood in the body. In the organs, outside the organs, in the vessels, whatever, would be about 1.5 gallons. So about 1.5 gallons of blood in a man this size. Trivia question for tonight. He's the same size as this guy. Anybody recognize? And same age. This is a guy in his early 30s. Anybody recognize that guy? John Paul II. 5'10", 175. Same as John Paul II in his early 30s. Who had a boat and didn't have to walk. Okay, now, I want to get into the nitty-gritty, but first, this is very difficult to do. It's difficult, heck, it's impossible. Put yourself in this position. Now, this is. You think about the environment when all of this stuff is taking place. The sounds, the sights, the smells, the emotion, just it's raucous, it's loud, it's violent. To put yourself in that situation. And in my mind, I have this mental image that there may be people in Jerusalem at the time listening. It's Passover, it's a very busy time. But there are some people who may not wonder what the heck this is all about. They don't know. But there are two main groups of people, and I suspect a very large group. And this is what I call the contrast between jeers and tears. You've got a big, large group that this is what they want to have happen. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees are kind of fomenting this. This guy is a blasphemer, he's got to go. And you've got this small group that is, their emotions are just as high, but they're on the other side. And those are what I call the tears. So we got the jeers and the tears. The ones that think this is a great thing and are making fun of him, and the ones that think this is the worst thing that could ever happen, not knowing it's going to be the best thing that could ever happen. So, when I mentioned the Old Testament with this, these are just a few of the passages from the Old Testament that relate to this topic, to the Passion and the Crucifixion. There will be many more that you'll see as well. But they all relate back to this. When you hear in the Mass a priest of Melchizedek, the sacrifices of Melchizedek. Melchizedek, really kind of the role model in the Old Testament for a sacrificial figure, the sacrificial lamb, Abraham and Isaac. Keep that word in mind. Sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. That's what this story really relates to. So we've got a period of about 18 hours. From 9 o'clock Thursday night to about 3 o'clock Friday afternoon we're going to focus on. And it will not take 18 hours. We'll get you out of here for breakfast. Okay, what is he going through? What are the things that are affecting him? Emotional stress, and all of these, you can just we'll go line by line through the Gospels. Emotional stress, spiritual torment, abandonment. My buddies took off. What are friends for? Except for John. Sleeplessness. He's been beaten. The scourging. And even before he's carrying his cross, he's already walked 2.5 miles. Nothing to eat, nothing to drink, nothing to sleep. He's got 2.5 miles to go. So imagine you're up all night long. You're getting beat up on it every hour. And they want you to carry something like that from Brady Street Stadium here. That's 2.5 miles. That is a tremendous, that is a overwhelming demand. So we are in the upper room. It's Thursday evening for the Last Supper. The environment, at that point in time, Jerusalem's population is about 40,000 people. But it's in a city where the walls, the diameter is about 4 miles around. Now you've got 250,000 people in this area for this. They're all coming from all over the Mediterranean for a Jewish festival. And they're in the synagogue, the upper room of the synagogue on Mount Zion. And at the Last Supper, the passages that are in the Gospels, obviously the details, we know what happened. We know about the institution of the Eucharist at that too. We know that. Can you imagine being one of the apostles thinking, what in the heck is he talking about? What about my body? What about my blood? What is he talking about? And I often wondered, is Judas the only one who really knew what was going on? That really knew what the backstory was going to be behind this? So, they finish the Last Supper, go to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's about 9 o'clock Thursday night. Temperatures that time of year, typically upper 50s at nighttime, in the evening. So it's not warm and fuzzy. It's about a 1 mile walk. They have to walk a little bit south, out of one of the gates, through the Kidron Valley and up the Mount of Olives. Jesus asks him to wait here while I go pray. He goes a little farther up in what's called the Rock of Agony, which is today the Church of All Nations, which is in Jerusalem. This is by tradition, is what is felt to be the rock that he prayed at that time. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, if you just take the word Gethsemane emanates from the Hebrew word gachmanim. Gachmanim means oil press. It's an olive orchard. The olives will be pressed for olive oil. But if you go back to the Old Testament, oil is the symbol in the Old Testament for the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Ghost. And so here we are, if you go back to Psalms, in Gethsemane, the Spirit of God was crushed. And that relates to agony. This is the only time the word agony is used in the Bible. Now, when we think of agony, I hit my toe on the leg of the table. I was in agony. No, not in agony. Agony from the Greek, agonia, fear, terror, anxiety. That's what this agony was all about. The recognition, I know what I'm up against, take this cup away from me. That's agony. You know it's coming, you can't do anything about it. For God's will be done. And then the hematohydrosis. This is the bleeding. His sweat was like blood. His sweat was blood. And this is a This is a medical condition, hematohydrosis, or sometimes shortened to hemohydrosis. In the Greek, the ancient Greek text are thromboihaematos. Thromboihaematos is bleeding sweat. The blood is released through the skin. It used to be said, well, it was the sweat glands and the hair follicles and something happens and the cells break through. And there are now, particularly again, if you Google this term online, particularly if you hit the images icon, you'll find multiple cases with photographs of people that have this. And it is almost always associated with intense emotion, physically challenging episodes. There's certain areas of the body, eyes, the thinner the skin, the more it tends to happen. There have been at least one and perhaps now a second case of a skin biopsy being done at the time it happened. And the biopsies, other than the blood that's on the outside of the skin, everything else looks normal. Everything else looks okay. So this is a thing. This is not his blood was like, his sweat was like what? He was sweating, he was bleeding. It was both. Judas's betrayal, the only reason I bring this up, obviously it's an important part of the story. It is one of the very, very, very few things that is in all four Gospels. Judas's role is in all four Gospels. So he's taken in custody in the garden, and almost assuredly from the garden to the home of Annas, there were beatings. He was being beat during that trek. He's getting his first 0.8 of a mile in from his arrest. Now, Annas is a curious character. About a year and a half before this all took place, Annas was the chief high priest. For some reason, he was demoted. Don't know why, don't know how. But don't think that he was on the naughty list, as far as whoever demoted him within the Jewish power structure. Because his son-in-law, Caiaphas, took his place. So now, is Annas now going to be the puppet or the puppeteer? There's a reason they took Jesus to him first. Not clear why, but I think it was basically, this is where the strings were pulled to begin with. So they take him to Annas. We've gone so far from, this is one of the diagrams from that article. This is the upper room here, out the gate, up Kidron Valley, here's the Mount of Olives. From the Mount of Olives in Gethsemane, all the way back down, it's curious, Annas' residence was right next to Caiaphas, right here, very close to the upper room. So that's where we are now. They finished it with Annas here, and then they take him right next door to Caiaphas. And Caiaphas is the one who's really going to lead the charge in all of this, literally and figuratively. Caiaphas is the first to level the charge of blasphemy. And from a Jewish religious standpoint, the charge of blasphemy is applicable. We'll talk about in a minute why, from a legal standpoint, it's not applicable. One of the editorial comment, one of the silliest debates I think about this among people that are interested in this subject is while he was, there's terminology in some of the scriptures, some of the apocryphal gospels, that the argument was he slapped or punched. Well, who cares? In the Greek, there is the word rapisma, which means he was hitting with an open hand, or kalaphizo, which is the closed fist. Both words are there. So he got beat up. He got beat up while he's at the high priest's home. Interestingly, and I don't think it's ironic, but it's more interesting, at a road construction site just to the south of where Caiaphas' home was, this was in the 90s, they came across this. This is what's called an ossuary. An ossuary means literally a box of bones. And you can't see it very well, but on the side down here on the back, in Hebrew is written Caiaphas. So the question is this really the bones of Caiaphas? The location's right, the carbon dating is right, the diagrams on the outside, the carvings fit with that time period. But obviously there's no way to know for sure. And also in the same location, there is some evidence, there's some writings, ancient writings, that talk about Jesus being lowered into a sacred pit. I don't know if anyone, or into a pit. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that part of the story. It's something that isn't discussed very much. However, at this location where Caiaphas' house was, that's now where there's a church called St. Peter in Gallicantu. Gallicantu is the Latin word for cock's crow. We all know that story, okay? But if you go to the church, St. Peter in Gallicantu, there's a mosaic there. And this is a mosaic of Jesus with a harness and ropes attached to the upper part of his body. And at the bottom, it says in French, here, it was the French that built this church, it says, "En fosse profonde." I was put into a deep pit. If you go back to Psalms, the 88th Psalm, I am reckoned among those who go down to the pit. I'm a man without strength, forsaken. You have put me in the lowest pit. You have removed my acquaintances far from me. You've made me an object of loathing. So put that in the Gospels, and then nobody's debating whether or not he was put into a pit. Okay? All right. So the first trial, the Sanhedrin. We'll talk in a little bit in just a moment here about what is the Sanhedrin? What does that mean? What is it composed of? So he's brought before the Sanhedrin. He's standing here blindfolded, and his hands are tied. This is the first of two appearances. First trial, and this, but it's almost an oxymoron. A trial, but it's a civil and political group, not a judicial group. It's a civil group. That's the first issue to keep in mind. And at night, keep this at night in mind as well. The charge of blasphemy was leveled by Caiaphas. He appears before the Sanhedrin. He's guilty. Keep that in mind. He's blindfolded. He's assaulted. Second trial, right at about daybreak. This is what the Sanhedrin looked like, where they assembled. This is a map of the floor plan of the temple. And the chamber of hewn stones, right here, is a tiny little red box right there. Now, the temple is big. It's enormous. This is not a big space. There are 71 representatives in here, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, 35 on either side. The high priest, Caiaphas, would be sitting here, and the accused, in this instance, Jesus, is here. These are desks for recordings of the proceedings. So in the chamber, this happens. They are led by the Nazi and the Avbitdine. The Avbitdine would be Caiaphas in all likelihood. Now, this is the legal part. If you look at this, so far everything is a Jewish undertaking. It is a Jewish procedure, a Jewish trial, so to speak. Under Jewish law at that time, trials could not occur anywhere outside the chamber. He'd already been charged. He'd already been convicted. No trials allowed at these points in time. The first time you met before the Sanhedrin was at nighttime. That was a violation of Jewish law at the time. In Jewish law, you could be pronounced guilty not at the trial or the same day. It had to happen the next day or after that. So he's not only charged, he's convicted, found guilty at the same time.
On the first day.
And the day, yeah, that day. Deuteronomy is very clear in these two passages. A trial of a Jew has to have two corroborating witnesses or more. No witnesses. No arrests allowed at night. Jewish law did not allow an accused person to be arrested at nighttime. The Sanhedrin was an investigative body. We will figure this out. We will find out if there's something going on. They could not initiate the charges. And the charges were changed during the trial. That is also a violation of Jewish law at that time. Imagine that you're going to the courthouse and you've got a speeding ticket. And you walk in the courtroom and the judge says, you know what? We're charging you with drunk driving. You change it in the middle of it? No. There's got to be some consistency with that. Violation of Jewish law is no defense for the accused. Was not able to provide a defense. And the Sanhedrin is not allowed not only to convict, they're not allowed to pronounce a death sentence. Now, benefit of the doubt, they wanted a death sentence. They remember during the scene in front of Pilate that we'll talk about, they said, you are the only one that can do this. You're the only one that can crucify him. That's not for us. Why did they do it? Now, this is a reach on my part, perhaps. Try to put yourself in their place. Okay, their power structure is being threatened. Their understanding of their law and their philosophy is being threatened. Why did they do this? There's a few verses from Wisdom, the book of Wisdom, that I think would describe it better than I ever could. We're going to lie and wait for the righteous one. He's annoying to us. He opposes our actions. He reproaches us for transgressions of the law, charges us with violations of our training. He says he has knowledge of God and styles himself a child of the Lord. Merely to see him is a hardship for us. So back in the Old Testament, again, you plug this in to this scene in the Gospels, it helps explain the situation, I think. Okay, now we get to the Roman part of this. So he's brought before Pilate. Pilate's been the procurator of Judea for a while. And he knows not only his job is on the line if he doesn't do things right, if he doesn't have a good report back to Caesar, his life is on the line. So he's taken before Pilate, and he's told, this guy, he's a blasphemer. Blasphemy means nothing to the Romans. What is blasphemy? Blasphemy is a charge of a religious issue. The Romans don't care about that. Blasphemy, they don't care. It doesn't make a difference to them. So, the Sanhedrin says, oh, by the way, he said he's the king. And he's told his followers they don't have to pay anything to Caesar. They don't have to pay to Caesar, render unto Caesar, even though he did. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar. So they're changing the claims again to what's happening, that he was a foment of sedition and treason. So Pilate, his first attempt to say, you know what, I think this is beneath me. This is just a Jewish guy from some backwater town north of here. Who knows what, no good comes from Nazareth, right? So he says, you know what, I'll send him to Herod. He's Herod's problem. So Herod is one of the tetrarchs, one of the 4 kings in areas of Galilee, or area of Judea. And when Pilate finds out, okay, Jesus is from Galilee, that's Herod's problem. So he sends him to Herod, and as it says in the Gospels, he's exceedingly glad to see Jesus. And if you've watched things like Jesus Christ Superstar and some of those other things, it's almost, hey, the life of the party's here. I've heard about this guy. I want to do the thing you do, And if you're Herod and you see what happens when Jesus shows up, I think it would be a classic case of overpromise and underdeliver. He just said, well, this guy's nothing. He got nothing. He didn't say anything, didn't do anything. So, but to their credit, there's no evidence that he was mistreated or assaulted or abused while he's in front of Herod Antipas. So he goes back to Pilate. And, so now, the diagram's kind of very complex, but it looks like a Bettendorf road map here. You're just going everywhere. So, but I mean, they're everywhere around and in and outside the city of Jerusalem. So it goes back to Pilate, and by probably again, a lot of the texts that refer to this that is not in the New Testament. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ancient Roman texts and the ancient Greek texts. There are some statements that he was beaten on his way back to Pilate, and the translation from the Greek that he was caned or staved. Let me go back to that right there. Caned or staved. Okay, cane, beating somebody with a bamboo cane or something like that. A stave, if you're familiar with barrels that have staves in them with the metal band around them, they're pieces of wood about that thick, about that long, and that's what they would beat prisoners with. Just a hard, preserved piece of wood like that. The scourging itself, the fortress of Antonia, on the north side of the temple, at the fortress, it's now known, the stone pavement, or lathospatos, is the floor at the floor of the fortress. And even today, if you look at the stones on the floor there, you will find areas where Roman soldiers had carved in outlines for games that they played. And the Romans were very meticulous. They were very protocol driven. They had a particular protocol for scourging. And they perfected it over almost a whole 1,000 years or so. The Etruscan era, the Etruscans in mid and west side of Italy. This goes back almost 1,000 years before this episode happened. And it was pretty much kind of an introduction to, if you're gonna be executed, you know this is gonna happen first before they kill you. Except if you're a woman, a Roman senator, or a soldier. You're a Roman soldier. With one exception among the soldiers. If you deserted and you went and joined the enemy, and the Romans caught you, this is going to happen. So that was when the soldiers would receive their scourging. The scourging of Jesus, you lose count after a while. How do you count the number of physical assaults? Well, this is going to be the assaults of all assaults. He's already walked that 2.5 miles, no sleep, he's dehydrated. Hands are tied, and the emphasis on the trunk, the buttocks, front and back of the legs. And there were a variety of instruments used for scourging. The least of them was what's called the virga. The virga is basically a thick tree branch. Break it off, take off all the branches, that's what you beat them with. A scorpio. A scorpio is basically adding on to the virga some cords on the end of it that will have usually blunt ends, but they'll take like quills from feathers from the larger birds, tie them to it so there's something sharp as well. And it's something that's still some examples have been found in some archaeological digs, what's called Spanish cord still today. It's basically a leather handle with multiple leather straps going out. But in all likelihood, what was used with Christ was the flagrum. And the flagrum is usually about 3 or 4 leather cords about 2 feet long. And on those cords, there would be metal objects, typically lead balls, and then anything sharp was incorporated into the cords. Bone, glass, anything that had a sharp edge to it. And it was a very diabolically effective means of harming the tissue. This is impact against skin and the tissues below the skin, subcutaneous tissue, muscle. So you start with the contusions. And in the Greek literature, there's a term describing this technique called durantes. Durantes is a combination of flay and beat. So basically the soft tissues are being softened, even more so that the sharp objects can lacerate them. And some of the sharp objects are very, very long, so down to muscle depth. And remember, this is Palestine in the 1st century. No fat people, it's skin and bones is what you've got. So it was a military operation. There would be 4 soldiers and 1 leader. The quaterno was the 4 soldiers. The supervisor, the centurion, just almost like a horror movie name, the exactor mortis. The lictors were the ones who did the scourging, and it was usually 2. And in most scenes you see one back on the left, one back on the right, and alternating. Or sometimes one changing his position. How severe it was going to be was not usually dictated by the person ordering the scourging or the execution. It was basically how bad do the lictors want to treat this person. Now, the Jews also had scourgings. The Romans had theirs, the Jews had theirs. But Jewish law limited it to 39 lashes. 13 to the chest area, 13 to one shoulder, 13 to the other shoulder. Obviously, this was not a Jewish scourging. This was a Roman scourging. Their intent was not just to weaken the person, but to near collapse, if not fatal. The scourging of Jesus almost assuredly was in wide open public view. The Romans were a PR machine. If you acted up and this happened to you, everybody sees it. So they know, I don't want that to happen to me. I'm going to watch my P's and Q's with this. And in some of the Greek texts, the words translated particularly harsh, specifically to the scourging that Jesus endured. And again, if you refer to the shroud and you do a kind of a very morbid tally, we're nearly 400 marks that are counted on the shroud. This is, and when we go back to that information about the blood loss, the total blood volume, you've got nearly 400 marks from the scourging everywhere on your body. Every one of them is bleeding. And then the crowning with thorns. The soldier's now, he's done with the scourging. They've got him somewhere secure. They put the robe on him. They crown him. They put a wooden staff in his hand. They've got their own sticks. They're hitting the crown on his head. And every time they hit it, the thorns are impaling into the scalp. The nerves in the scalp, those you hit your head on something, you get out of the car too quick or hit a door frame or something, it hurts. If you've ever had a cut in your scalp, it bleeds like crazy. More blood loss here. And what was the crown? The suspicion is that there is the scientific name is the Ziziphus spina Christi. The Ziziphus spina Christi, the common name for it in the Middle East is Christ's thorn jujube. It has 1-inch thorn, and it's in all likelihood, although all of the crucifixes you may see, all of the artistic renditions you see, where it's more of the laurel wreath kind of shape, much more likely it was a helmet. And to some artists would think it looked like this. Just a mass of thorns on top of the head. Now, the symbolism of the robe and the crown. The robe is described in the Gospels as being red, scarlet. And in the book of Isaiah, you're as white as snow or as scarlet as sin. The correlation between scarlet and sin. He's wearing sin. And there's no mention of thorns in the Old Testament except after Adam and Eve's fall in the Garden of Eden. So he goes back to Pilate and he's back to the Jewish mob. And I'm just trying to give Pilate an out here. I think there was a period in time there where Pilate thought, okay, if I'm going to keep my job and keep my head, I don't want this guy to be executed. So what did he do? Well, Barabbas. He said, I'm going to give you Barabbas. That ought to take the pressure off, appease the mob. Well, that didn't work. And when he washed his hands, more than just a symbolic, I think the meaningfulness. If you go back to Deuteronomy, there's a passage in the 21st chapter that if you are in a situation that you don't want to control, that you don't want to be associated with, I wash my hands of it. So obviously, did Pilate know the Hebrew Old Testament, know the Pentateuch? I doubt it, but I think there's a reason that happened the way he did it. So when Jesus carries the cross, now we've gone from 9 p.m. to 12 hours later. We've gone around the clock. Whether or not Jesus was clothed in any way, loincloth, robe, any kind of garment, we don't know. Dismas and Gestas, the only way we know these names, the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, which dates back to the 4th century, put these names on the two thieves that were crucified with him, with Dismas being the good thief. Okay? So Jesus carries the cross. However, this is another thing that if you look at the artwork, the history of the artwork of the crucifixion, this probably is not what he was carrying. We'll come back to that. It probably was more like this. Arms lashed to the crossbar, what we call the patibulum, with rope. There are two characters in this scene, two characters in this story that I really just kind of capture my imagination. One of them is Simon. Simon of Cyrene carries the cross. This is where Jesus is at the point where he meets what Isaiah's prophecy is. You can't even recognize it. He doesn't look like anybody that you've ever seen before. Simon is from Cyrene, and Cyrene is in North Libya. You go from Jerusalem all the way west of the Mediterranean, halfway to Gibraltar. Halfway down the Mediterranean is where Cyrene is at, just off the coast. 1,100 miles, whether you're sailing or going by camel. It's 1,100 miles. So here's a guy that we don't know. We assume he was a Jew from Cyrene because he was there during the Passover. And that was part of his obligation. He travels 1,100 miles. And did he volunteer? Sounds like he was asked to do it because he looked interested or because he couldn't find anybody else strong enough to do it. We don't know that. But I think the contrast between the 1,100 mile trip he made and then the 600 yards from the fortress to Golgotha. I mean, this is a much shorter distance, but a much more important distance. Because we know that Simon became a Christian, and Rufus and his other son, blocking on the name now. Rufus is cited in the Acts of the Apostles as son of Simon. And it's assumed that his son became a follower of Paul's as well. So probably Simon went back to Cyrene, back to North Africa, and started the conversion process there. And I would venture to guess it's because of this 600 yards that he traveled with Jesus. What did he carry? This is probably what it looked like. And because the entire cross, the upright and the crossbar would have been about 300 pounds. It was a black pine. It was the most common wood used for this. And for a cross big enough to hold a man of this size, it had to be about 300 pounds. Jesus probably carried only the patibulum, the crossbar. Only is not the word to use. About 100 pounds. You got a 175-pound man who's beat up, he's bleeding, he hasn't eaten, slept, had anything to drink, and he's going to carry 100 pounds, 600 yards. This is not falling 3 times. That's a miracle to me. It wasn't more often. And then, if you know the story, the tradition of Jesus, his 6th wound on the shoulder. There are on the shroud, you can see a little area on the back of one shoulder that looks like it bled more, where the wood would have been rubbing on the shoulder. So he gets up to Golgotha, and in Mark he says they gave him wine with myrrh to drink, or in another passage, wine mixed with gall. That's referred back in Psalm 69 as well. Before he's crucified, that mixture has somewhat of an analgesic property. It would be like putting Tylenol and ibuprofen together, okay, in a glass of wine. Or was it just another mockery? Were they still making fun of it? But he didn't drink it anyway. He refused to drink it. The crucifixion itself, Golgotha, Aramaic would have been Jesus' native language. Golgotha is the Aramaic word for skull. In Latin, Calvaria, Calvary, is where skull. That's the word for skull as well. So, and again, this is outside of the walls of Jerusalem. But if you think back to those maps we looked at, out of the gates are all these roads. This would be like doing a crucifixion at Kimberly and Brady, in the busiest place you can find. Roads coming in and out. There's 250,000 people there for that occasion. And this is what they're all going to see. Again, public view. They want to see what this is all about. Now, the history of crucifixion, not to belabor it too much, we can date it back to King Darius of the Persians, long before Christ. But then the Macedonians, led by Alexander, go east and conquer the Persians. And Alexander discovers, crucifixion. This is a good way to kind of subdue the territories and keep them under control that we've conquered. He completes his lap around the area of the Tigris and Euphrates, and he heads west again into North Africa. It's introduced into Egypt and Carthage, just to the west of Egypt. And then the Romans end up conquering North Africa, and they learn it from the Carthaginians, and they turn it into a protocol, a process. They perfect it as a means of torture and punishment, maximizing suffering and a slow death, worst for the worst. And a number of Roman authors, Seneca particularly, makes the comment, he had witnessed crucifixions in this area, not just of one kind, but many different ways. Victims head down, impaled on private parts, stretched out their arms. And remember what we said about the quaterno. How it's done, the scourging and the crucifixion as well is at the discretion of the people doing it. There was no set formula for this. Livy and Plutarch and many other Roman and Greek authors from that era will have discussed crucifixion. Clothes, perhaps, maybe likely, but anything that was on, you think about a Band-Aid you have on something that was scabbed over, and you pull it off, what happens? It bleeds again. Anything that he's wearing that comes off is going to start bleeding again. So keep it. And divided among them, we're all familiar with that. And this is the issue of what kind of cross was used. When you think about cross, think about capital T and small t. All right. The Tau cross, the Crux Commissa. The Crux Commissa would be the capital T. And this is probably the one that was used. Like this. Rather than the Crux Immissa, the Latin cross, which is the small t, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But there were a variety of ways to do it. You know, the St. Andrew's cross, the Greek cross. But historical evidence is that in Palestine at that time, the Romans preferred the Tau cross, the capital T. But it was, again, up to the imagination. What did we have available to do this with? If they didn't have the equipment, they made do with the infelix lignum, which is a Latin for the unhappy or unfortunate tree. Find a tree. Just nail them to a tree. And then there were other that mentioned in Deuteronomy, and the crux simplex, which was a single stake. And this was something that some faiths even today think this is the way that Christ or others were crucified. Some of the minor sects in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and there are some Christian organizations, denominations that really stress the Jewish tradition of their Christian religion that will not maintain, but they think that this would have been the way that Christ was crucified as well. So now the anatomy of the cross, very basic. The stipes is the upright part. And it was usually a permanent post in the ground. It was already set. The patibulum had, let me go back again here. The patibulum would be the cross piece that had a little slot in the middle of it. And it was just a tab A, slot B type of thing. So he would carry the patibulum, that 600 yards, that 100 pounds on his back. And the patibulum, occasionally there would be what was called a sedile or a sedulum. That was a little, in some crucifixions you'll see a little wooden piece right behind the buttocks that was generously called a seat that would look like this. That was not for comfort. That was just to make them live longer and suffer longer. Or otherwise, you would have what was called a supedanium. Now, this was quite rare in Christ's time, so we probably didn't have it. A supedanium is a footrest, okay? Right down here. The titulus was the final piece. That was the plate that went up top with the name and the information. So he's there, and a lot of the artistry of this is misleading. I won't say misleading. Is not in accordance with what those of us who study this stuff think has happened. He's there. He's untied from the patibulum. The patibulum is put on the ground. He's laid back on it. Then he's nailed to his arms are nailed to the patibulum. And because the post, the stipes, is upright. The feet aren't going to be nailed till he's up. So he's nailed while he's on the ground to the patibulum. And this is the other thing. If you nail into the middle of the palm, that's not going to hold. You're not going to be able to accomplish this. There are very good cadaver studies done that if you put a nail into the middle of the palm and put them up with their body weight, the nail's going to pull out. There's not enough here to hold the nail in place. And if you go back to more or less medical literature from that period, that era, what we consider the wrist, they called part of the hand. The wrist in that time was here. So this would still be considered the hand. So historically, it probably was here. And for mechanical purposes, the palms can't hold the body weight, so it would have gone in right about there, right at the heel of the hand.
And in that part of the hand and the wrist, there are the carpal bones. There are 8 carpal bones, all about as big as half of your thumb. There is a space right smack dab in the middle of those, space of Destow, another French surgeon, that the bony architecture is stable, but the ligaments are very strong. If you put it in that space, that will hold body weight. The problem is, for those of you who've had carpal tunnel problems, the median nerve is the nerve that travels in the carpal tunnel. This nail is going right through the median nerve. And the median nerve, if you think what it's like to hit your funny bone on the edge of a table. Think about a sharp spike going through your median nerve, gives you sensation to the thumb, these 2 fingers, part of this finger, and it doesn't stop. And with a median nerve injury, if you look at many depictions of Christ after he's down from the cross, and particularly on the shroud, if you have an injury to the median nerve, the muscles that are supplied by that, some of them pull the thumb into the palm. The tendons that go to the thumb that pull it into the palm are also going to be injured by this. On the shroud, the hands are like this. You don't see the thumbs. They're turned in. So when you see a crucifix you see Jesus in the tomb, or Jesus being taken down from the tomb, or even on the crucifix, and the thumbs are into the palm, that's probably why. That depicts what happened with the median nerve. We know from Psalms that no bones are broken, but there is a passage in the 22nd Psalm, all my bones are out of joint. And if you remember in Gibson's Passion of the Christ, the scene where the right arm is being pulled out, and they're trying to get a lot of tension on it, and the shoulder pops out of place. So dislocations, perhaps, but no fractures anywhere. Okay. I'm proud to say, as a homeboy at St. Paul's, one of the few crucifixes that shows where the nails probably really were. You go look in our church here, and you look at the crucifix. The nails are where they're supposed to be. Okay? That was just a shameless plug for St. Paul's. All right. So now, bear with me. We're going to get through this, guys. I promise. I don't like this part either, but it's pretty important. You got your wrists are nailed, and then how do you get tab A into slot B? The common scene you see in the movies or in your imagination is he's laying down and they bring the cross up in that T fashion. It slides down in there. Maybe, but probably not. This is what it would have looked like in that situation. But keep in mind, we've got some guys on ladders here, things like that. And there are other illustrations where there are other instruments, basically forks, big wooden forks they're using to push the cross up. With a low cross, if the stipes was not too tall, you would have 4 soldiers, 2 on either side, pick up the patibulum and the victim and lift it up and fit it on the stipes. Put tab A in slot B. If it was too high of a cross, these guys would use those forks and ladders. But it was a matter of lifting him up, suspended by his wrists, to fit onto that, and then nailing the feet. The whole time being mocked and taunted. The titulus crucis, that is the top, what you see at the top of the cross. And it is considered, in the Roman world at that time, it's a legal document. It was a document that explained why this happened, what were the charges. But in this case, it was in all 3 languages common at the time: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Anybody that was going by this scene could read that and say, I know what that means. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But it was satire. It was a sneer. If this is what the King of the Jews looked like, the Jews are no good. No, this is their king. It was a public announcement. Don't mess with us. Okay, this is something that my mind has changed over the past few years about the feet. Clearly, the Romans preferred nails to rope. And classically, like what you see in the crucifix up here, well, there's a supedanium there the feet are nailed to. The feet being nailed to the front of the cross. Either one nail for both feet or one nail for each foot. It could have been just like this. One of the strongest parts in the middle of the foot is right there, right smack dab. It goes from the top down through the arch, And there's a lot of important structures. And when we're talking about blood loss, what we call the arterial arch on the bottom of the foot, in the arch of the foot, very rich blood supply. So could it have been that? Where my mind is starting to change is whether or not it was nailed through the heels. And the reason I say that, in 1968, another archaeological dig, Givat HaMiftar, in Israel, they found there was an ossuary there with bones in it, labeled Johanan ben Hegkol, the son of Hegkol. And the carbon dating takes him back to about the first 10, 20 years of that time, before Jesus' crucifixion. But it was a Jewish male, probably in his 20s. And what they found that was of interest on the right-hand side here, this is a heel bone, a calcaneus, with an iron nail going in from the outside to the inside, and a fragment of olive wood underneath the head of the nail. So if you recreate that, it looks like this. This would have been the foot, the nail going in with this wood here, theoretically, to keep the foot, just to make it more secure. And the feet were nailed to the sides of the upright, to the sides of the stipes. Okay, same function, just a different technique. And so whether or not that's how it happened. Interestingly, in this ossuary, they found the bones of the hands, the wrists, and the forearm, and no evidence of nails in that area. So he's probably tied here, nailed at the feet. So the position of Jesus on the cross, quite similar to what you see there, quite similar to what you see in the church. The feet were plantar flex, toes down, kind of the point position. But if you think about it, if you're going to put your toes down and you're going to put your weight on them, you got to flex your knees. And if their knees are flexed, they got to be rotated a bit at the hips and flexed as well. So the classic position you see like here or like that would have probably been the way that he looked. So we'll come back to the breathing too. Now, after Barbet's book and some of the shroud investigations in the 60s and 70s, this was a model that was made of what Jesus probably looked like on the cross. Now, this is with nothing under his feet, no supedanium, no sedile, and the hands are nailed. Very similar, I was like, just with my great devotion to John Paul, very similar to the staff that he would use. But now, if you take the information about the nails in the wrists and what it looks like on the shroud, this is probably a better rendition of what Jesus looked like. And if you look at the back, the image on the back would be the back of the person on the shroud. You'll see outlines of blood trails. And on the right arm, the trail is different than it is on the left. So the symmetry was not there. His arm would have been bent more on the right because the blood trail is this way, whereas on the left, it's more horizontal. So this is probably the way he would have looked. Paradoxical respiration. When you breathe, you want to take a deep breath, you got to use muscles to do that, to inhale. That's an active motion. To exhale, easy. It's passive. You don't have to work. In a crucified position, it's just the opposite. If you want to inhale, you have to just relax. If you think about it, remember in the old days, you watch the old cartoon, somebody needs more air and they move their arms up and down like this. You raise your arms up in the air, it's when you're breathing hard, you can't catch me when you've been running. You put your hands like this, it increases your chest size. Put your arms up like this, your chest gets bigger, and just that negative pressure pulls in the air. So to be able to breathe on the cross, you have to actively exhale, passively inhale. So as your body would lower, this diagram here on the left, the chest gets bigger. That's how Jesus would have inhaled. And to exhale, he would have had to pull up on his wrists and push up on his feet to be able to exhale. That was the active part. And assuredly, very shallow breathing. The term we use, diaphragmatic breathing. The chest isn't really expanding. The diaphragm's going up and down a little bit. It's just what we would term agonal breathing. Just very shallow. You're ending up with a high carbon dioxide level in your blood, your muscles spasm, your oxygen levels dropping, your heart rate's going up. So when you hear the word excruciating, break that word down. X is out of, and cruciatus, out of the cross. So excruciating is not breaking your toe. Excruciating is truly, literally the term out of the cross. So now Jesus is on the cross, and we know the notations in the Gospels about his 7 last words. Better term, 7 last phrases, but I'm not gonna quibble with the Gospels. And here, he's on the cross. We've talked about his breathing. We're not going to get a sermon. We're not going to get a dissertation. It's going to be short. It's going to be quiet. It's going to be difficult. But at least the words are recorded. Forgive them, number 1. Number 2, to Dismas, you'll be with me in paradise. Number 3, to John, this is your mother. To Mary, this is your son. Number 4, in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. In Aramaic, that's the Galilean Aramaic, this is the only time in the entire New Testament that Jesus addresses God as anything other than his Father. He addresses God as if we would address God. He doesn't address him as his Father. Okay? This is the abandonment associated with it. I thirst. So he's offered Pascha. And Pascha is a fermented, very sour liquid that is mixed with water and herbs, and the peasants and the Roman infantry would drink it. Cheap, high alcohol content. But the parallels, if you go back to the original Passover, the lamb's blood put on the doorpost. Jesus is given Pascha on a hyssop stalk, and hyssop was used to put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost in Egypt. Number 6, it is finished. This is one of the most powerful things out of the 7 that I think that gets my attention. In the Greek writings about this particular text, the word tetelestai. Tetelestai is a Greek word meaning paid in full. And in some of the museums, some of the archaeological work in the Mediterranean, you will find papyrus text, papyrus receipts. Just like you pay your bill, you're paid in full. You'd find the word tetelestai written on there, paid in full. So what he's saying on the cross is not, I am finished. It is finished. My work is finished. So paying in full for all of our debts. And then finally, into your hands I commend my spirit. An academic point with this, there's some, I don't think are very important arguments. Did he really die because of physical factors, or did he just say, okay, my work's done? How he lived this long is one of the biggest divine mysteries I have. Tre ore, the 3 hours, noon to 3 o'clock. Middle of the day, noon to 3, it's dark. Air temperature, typically that time of day, that time of year, it's about 70 degrees. It's going to be dropping down to about 50 like it was the night before. There's no sun. And in the Old Testament, darkness was a symbol of God's judgment. Jesus' side is pierced. This is a tactic that the Roman soldiers were trained in. Shield in the right hand, spear in the left hand. Going for the right side of the chest. So they were just following orders, and they were to aim for the right 5th intercostal space, meaning between the 5th and 6th ribs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right there, the right ventricle, left ventricle, base of the lung is right here. Very, very specific point. Out went blood and water. And what we have to understand is in the Greek, which the original translations, blood and water doesn't mean it came out blood first, water second. When the Greeks would say something and something, it was in order of prominence, not in order of sequence. So, more blood than water, which would make sense. Because water would build up the pericardium, the heart, the sac that holds the heart. In someone who's being physically abused like this much of a stress, the pericardial fluid would build up. The pleural fluid, which is the fluid in the lung cavity, would build up as well, but not as much. If you put a spear into that area, even in a dead man, there's going to be bleeding from the chest cavity and from the heart. So blood more so than water. And the symbolism here is if you go back to the book of Ezekiel. So here we've got the lance piercing his side, blood and water coming out. If you read the 47th chapter of Ezekiel, on the Temple Mount, beneath the temple, particularly on feasts and especially on Passover, thousands and thousands of animals sacrificed at one time. And they had a plumbing system that, blood at the base of the altar, it would go down under the temple, and it had a route to go out the side of the temple. And in all likelihood, there was also a water table under the temple, because if you go to Ezekiel, he talks about the east side, west side, different sides of the temple, the water coming out of the side of the temple. So if the water and the blood were mixed because of the sacrifice and the water, the analogy between what we see here with Christ and what we see at the temple story is pretty clear. This is my second favorite character in the story, St. Longinus. Now you think Longinus is a centurion. This is a Roman soldier. Sainthood doesn't come into play. Well, Longinus had been a veteran in the Roman legion. He'd been there a long time. He was just doing his duty, to the point where he was nearly blind. His vision was almost gone. And by tradition tells us that the blood and the water fell on his face, and his vision was restored. To the point where he converted, he followed the apostles, ended up becoming a monk in Cappadocia, south central Turkey. He wouldn't stop preaching, so the king there, first thing he did, he had his teeth taken out. And he wouldn't stop preaching, so he cut his tongue out. He finally died after that, executed after that. And I can't get confirmation of this, but the story is that the lance he used to pierce Christ's side is contained in one of the pillars at St. Peter's. Crua, leg, phraseum, fracture, or in Greek, skelicopia. You break the legs because if you don't have legs to push up on, you can't breathe. So we're going to break the legs. Well, Jesus is already dead, so no need to do that. And again, fulfilling the Old Testament. Not a bone will be broken. And after Jesus' death, he's brought down from the cross. The earthquake happens. Very important part of this, the temple veil. The temple veil is torn in half. And the important part, from top to bottom. This is a 50, 60 foot tall veil. Nobody can tear it from top to bottom. And also the hem is at the top. Try to tear a hem. It's harder to tear a hem than it is to tear it from the bottom. So the temple veil is torn in half. And the custom was, leave the corpse out. There are plenty of animals at nighttime that would scavenge. That would come take care of the problem. You had to have permission. Now think about Joseph of Arimathea. The man that Joseph has been following and listening to has just been killed by Pilate. And he knows that if he's found to be associated with this guy, the Pharisees and the Sadducees may have the same thing happen, even though he's one of them. Okay? He goes to Pilate to ask for the body. Talk about putting yourself out there. He's just saying, I'm in with this guy, I just want this body. So he gets permission from Pilate to do it. And particularly the Jews, it was a violation of Sabbath to have a dead body out after Sabbath starts, which starts at sunset that night. So he's taken to the tomb, wrapped in linen. Joseph of Arimathea has the hewn tomb in the stone. Now, the history of the crucifixion in art, not to belay, I'm not an art expert. There's many, many ways, sculpture, etchings, paintings, that you'll see it depicted. But what you need to understand is that none of this really started appearing until about 500 years or more after the crucifixion. One big reason, if you were doing artwork that included the crucifixion, what was going on during the first few centuries after Jesus? Diocletian, all the persecutions. Christians were going to the lions. Christians were being executed. You're not going to advertise it. You're not going to do that. The people that did do artwork, kind of, about the crucifixion, as early as the 2nd century, the Alexamenos Graffito. This is in the Patagogium was a building in Rome built by Nero for training slaves, male servants. And it was like a boys' school. So what do boys do in a school? They write on the walls. So what we see is this. We see a man on a cross crucified with a donkey's head. And what the term says, what the Roman inscription here says, Alexamenos sebete theon. Alexamenos worships his God. This is satire. This is making fun of Christianity. There was no greater humiliation than being crucified. So the first indication is in the 5th century. The Maskell ivories are in the British Museum. There are 4 of them. This is the one that shows Christ crucified, Roman soldier, John, Mary, and Judas, who'd hanged himself. This is the first real artistic rendition of the crucifixion. The first sculpted one. About 100 years later, this is in the Laurentian Library in Florence, the Rabula Gospels. The depiction not only of Jesus, pretty much the whole story. The 2 thieves, the lance, splitting the garment, Mary, John, everybody's in this image. All right. Can you recreate this? No. Why? Why would you want to? People have tried. This guy here, Dr. Zugibe, he just passed away about 10 years ago. He was a medical examiner in Long Island. A very deep researcher in this area. And he had subjects that, these were all leather, strapped to a crucifix type appearance. 5 minutes tops. You couldn't even get any information. Nobody could tolerate it for that long a period of time. And the cadaver studies are about all we have to go on, so ethically you can't replicate it. Now, cause of death. Let's get to the forensic part of all of this. And we're almost done. Cause of death, many hypotheses, but not to minimize this too much, we just need to keep it simple. Keep it simple. The hypotheses, you got trauma and what we call the death triad in medicine. You have problems with blood clotting, you have problems with hypothermia, you have problem with acidosis, you're not getting enough oxygen. Was it a pulmonary embolus? Doubtful. That's too common. Coagulopathy. In Galilean Jews, there is a coagulation problem with the blood called a factor V syndrome, which is a little higher incidence in Galilean Jews than other populations. No, that probably would not have done this. I think it's much simpler than that. Cardiac causes. You have a heart attack. You have an arrhythmia. Stroud, in 1847, he was made fun of because he said Jesus died of a broken heart. Well, okay, but think about that literally. You hear about the stories about thoroughbred racehorses. They'll run till their heart breaks, right? Till their heart bursts. People can be so physically exerted that their left ventricle will rupture, particularly if it's been damaged before. Well, that's pretty doubtful for a healthy 33-year-old man. Asphyxiation, suffocation, okay, to some extent, the work of breathing was too hard. In the penetrating chest injury, we know from the Gospels description, he was already dead. So a penetration to the heart itself probably was not the cause. Most likely cause, building up to it, hypovolemic shock, low volume, excessive blood loss, asphyxia, not breathing, just because he's exhausted. And then dehydrated as well. So you've got a situation, we use the analogy, which I think is not more than just an analogy, it's a true picture. The sacrificial lamb bleeding out, blood volume was too low to sustain life. And if you put that into modern scientific terms, the Advanced Trauma Life Support System has a classification for hemorrhage. This would have classified as a class 4 hemorrhage. More than 40% blood loss, immediately life-threatening, requires rapid transfusion or immediate surgical intervention. So, if Jesus' was a class 4, more than 40% blood volume in 18 hours, more than half a gallon of blood spilled, and it had to be more than that. You got 1.5 gallons of total blood volume. It doesn't seem like much, a gallon and a half, But it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much. So, old and new blood. Even today, some of the ancient practitioners, some of the early Christians that are still up in the hills in that part of the world, they will still do the sacrificial lamb. And because blood is sacred to them as it was to the ancient Jews. Blood is the life. If you go to the Pentateuch, the early books in the Bible, the first books in the Bible, if you're going to eat the meat, there can't be any blood in it. You cannot eat the blood. That is life. Blood is life. And even to this day, as it was then, the lamb was slaughtered by the shochet. The shochet was the trained slaughterer, the person who would do this, would cut the throat of the lamb and hang it upside down, drain the blood out, or any other animal that they were sacrificing. And that was the only way that it was kosher. Now, to put a light on that, the word kosher, obviously we use that, when we're shopping, but Jesus had to be kosher. If he was going to save the Jewish people, he had to be kosher. It had to be an exsanguination. That's our term for blood loss, bleeding out. From a surgeon's perspective, two words that just make our hair stand on end and make us nauseous. Bleeding out. You can't stop it. You blood so much, you can't keep that patient alive. So when you're at Mass and you're doing, Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. It's the Agnus Dei. So when you're doing the Agnus Dei, you think about, okay, here's the altar. The lamb is bleeding out, surrounded by all of the hosts of heaven. And even on this altarpiece from Germany, from the 1300s, the lamb has got the cup bleeding into it, right next to the crucified Christ. The bleeding out. The statement that Paul made to the Philippians. You think about, you fall in love with someone, you commit to them forever. What do you tell them? I want to give you everything. I want you to have everything. You are everything to me. I want to be everything to you. I will do everything for you. And Paul writes to the Philippians, Christ emptied himself. Everything. It's as if he was, literally the sacrificial lamb at that point in time. That's what he had to do. And without that, none of this, none of what we do here, none of what we believe really makes a lot of sense. If someone is able to sacrifice that much, completely emptying themselves, knowing what they're going towards, that is about as much in the way of love and charity as you can imagine. So, to close up with this, I want to tie in the last Old Testament, New Testament part of this. If you go back to the book of Isaiah in the 43rd chapter, Isaiah's vision and God's talking to him, and God is saying, behold, I'm accomplishing new things. And then you forward thousands of years later, and you go to the second to last chapter in the book of Revelation. And John is by himself. He's on the island of Patmos. And his visions of the apocalypse. And Jesus says to him, behold, I make all things new. Tying all of that together. That's what this is all about. That's what everything is new. It is a tragic story. It is a horrible story. It is a painful story. But those of you who've, we've all been through those times, the darkness before the dawn. It's going to get worse. It's worse before it gets better. That's what Easter's all about. That's what this story is all about. The story doesn't end with where we finish tonight. The story begins with this on Easter morning. So, God bless y'all for thanking. Thank you for coming.